Sternguard veterans are unsurprisingly veterans of the Space Marines that tend to prefer ranged combat, but being Space Marines and veterans no doubt, they don't mind getting their hands dirty when it gets up close, they just like to use their ranged weapons of all kinds against the enemies of the Imperium. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Sternguard veterans, the shooting class veterans of the Space Marines. So, the Sternguard veterans come in at 90 points for 5 or 180 points for 10. They have a standard Space Marine stat line of 6 inches of movement, toughness 4, a 3+ save, 2 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 1. A solid enough stat line, though nothing outstanding. In terms of ranged weapons, they all come standard with the Sternguard Bolter, which is rapid fire 1, devastating wounds, heavy assault. It has 2 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP 1, and damage 1. Very good against light and medium infantry. And with devastating wounds, can chip surprisingly well. They also have a Sternguard Bolt Pistol, which is devastating wounds with 1 attack that hits on 3s at 12-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. A standard bolt pistol, just with a little extra. They have 2 heavy weapon options, either the Pyre Cannon or Sternguard Heavy Bolter. The Pyre Cannon is Torrent, ignores cover, d6+1 attacks that auto-hit at 12-inch range with strength 6, AP 1, damage 1. Even more anti-infantry shooting, which is always appreciated. Or you have the Sternguard Heavy Bolter, which is heavy, sustained hits 1, devastating wounds, 3 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range with strength 5, AP 1, and damage 2. They actually hit on 4s, sorry. The combi weapon is Rapid Fire 1, devastating wounds, anti-infantry 4+, 1 attack that hits on 4s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. Overall, between the heavy weapons, I would generally take whichever you think is cooler, but I'd say the Sternguard Heavy Bolter is my preferred one just because it allows them to chip in at range instead of just up close, though the Pyre Cannon still works at rapid fire range very well. Then in terms of melee weapons, they have all close combat weapons with 4 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1. Then there's the Chainsword, which is 6 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 4, AP 1, and damage 1. A Power Fist, which is 4 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 8, AP 2, and damage 2. Or a Power Weapon, which is 5 attacks, hit on 3s at strength 5, AP 2, and damage 1. Their ability is Sternguard Focus. When this unit targets the Oath of Moment, you can reroll a wound roll of 1. This applies it both in range and in melee, which is certainly an interesting thing, but does help just a little bit with their consistency against big targets, which will usually be the Oath target. In terms of loadout, every model is equipped with a Sternguard Bolt Pistol, Sternguard Bolter, and Close Combat Weapon. 1 in every 5 Sternguard can have their Bolter replaced with a Sternguard Heavy Bolter or Pyre Cannon. Any number of models can swap their Sternguard Bolter for a combi weapon, and the Sergeant can replace his Sternguard Bolter with one of the following, either a combi weapon, Power Fist, Power Weapon, or Chainsword, or a Power Fist and Sternguard Bolter, Power Weapon and Sternguard Bolter, or Chainsword and Sternguard Bolter. I would generally bring one of the melee plus bolter combos on the Sergeant. I wouldn't bring any combi weapons, and then I would usually bring the Heavy Bolter. Now, the Pyre Cannon is a fine option also for the special weapons of the unit. Do keep in mind, though, that if you give the Sergeant one of the melee weapons and bolters, you can't swap out the bolter for a combi weapon, so just keep that in mind if you are a big combi weapon fan and want to use them with those weapons. In terms of buffing options, though, which is the next thing we're covering, we're going to start with the core options, which would be the Captain, who is definitely more of a melee character, and while these guys are actually pretty solid in melee, given their veteran attack stats, I don't think it's worth buffing. The Lieutenant gives them lethal hits, but I do think that sort of conflicts with devastating wounds, which would be more useful against things with like 2+ saves, and overall it's just a little bit of anti-synergy, but lethal hits is always very good, and these guys do appreciate that. It's still a good option. The Chaplain is very similar to the Captain. He is a purely melee character. Again, their melee isn't bad, but not worth buffing. The Ancient offers basically nothing as usual. A 4+ invulnerable from a Librarian is pretty nice. His shooting is solid against Marines, and could be a decent anti-infantry unit with some solid durability, though in general, the Librarian's not my first choice. The Tech Marine is a very shooty character, so not a bad match for these guys if you do want to use the Tech Marine as a leader instead of just running him solo alongside your vehicles. The Judiciary is again a purely melee character and definitely not worth giving to these guys. These guys are decently valuable, so an Apothecary reviving them isn't a bad choice, though I'd generally keep him with something like Hellblasters, given their special ability to shoot on death. Bringing them back to life allows for potentially a lot more shooting opportunities with that model. Of course, next we are going to move on from the core characters onto the Codex-specific ones for the Divergent chapters and the Codex characters. Cato offers them scouts and some decent threat in general with their melee and shooting, though Cato just in general sucks both in lore and in game. I'm sorry to that one Cato fan. Tigurius would actually be very solid with these. Tigurius has very solid shooting, and this is pretty much the best shooting unit he can lead, so I think he complements them quite well and makes a solidly dangerous unit. Ventress prefers to be with melee cheap bodyguards, though not a bad option in general, just prefers others. Calgar is an absolute melee beast and does not want to be hunting enemy infantry. He needs to be tangoing with tougher enemy units than just their grunts. This is probably Pedro Cantor's best spot. In rapid fire range, they will have a lot of shots with their extra attacks, and their melee is solid too to complement Pedro's. And definitely I'd say how I would run Pedro Cantor, which if you do, very cool because Pedro's a cool character. Adrax is a melee beast, not suited for shooting light grunts. Same with Corsaro Khan, who wants to be hunting enemy elites. And then the Castellan and the Marshal of the Black Templars are just reskinned Captain and Lieutenant. I forgot to include the Emperor's Champion, but of course he's not going to want to lead these guys. The Blood Angel's Captain is a reskinned normal Captain, with arguably even more of a melee slant. Though, so the same things apply there. Similar with the Castellan and Marshal, they're just reskins effectively. Next up, the Sanguinary Priest gives these guys AP, which actually turns them into very competent threats in melee, turns them into effectively assault intercessors with a better sergeant and guns, which is pretty fun, honestly, though I would say he's better with assault intercessors for a little bit cheaper. Since they already have AP, you're just getting more value out of gaining AP. Asmodai is a melee chaplain, so I don't really need to say much about that. Azrael prefers melee units, or if he's at range, he prefers to be with Hellblasters, and Ezekiel definitely has a more melee slant. His shooting isn't too bad as a sniper attack, not a bad spot for him, but just not my first choice. And Lazarus sucks, and these guys already innately have the Deathwing keyword as they are veterans, so he doesn't even have the benefit of handing out the Deathwing keyword, which is really the only thing Lazarus has going for him because his datasheet is so, in general, flimsy and pointless. Next up, we're on to detachments. So in terms of detachments, Gladius, they could be a target for Fire Discipline, and I think it would actually be pretty fun, though definitely not as powerful as something like Aggressors. They can get +1 to wound in Anvil, which makes them pretty general purpose against, again, all kinds of infantry and vehicles that are like below toughness 8, with that +1 to wound, of course, being very solid against them. The Ironstorm rerolls aren't super useful on them just because they rely on a volume of attacks compared to just a small number of them. Firestorm Assault is redundant as they already have it, except on their Heavy Bolter and Flamer, though the extra strength does really help when they get in close, especially with something like the Heavy Bolter or the Pyre Blaster. Stormlance, they do have Assault on their standard guns, though the Heavies lack it, so Advance and Charge can be useful on them. First Company is a bad detachment, but they do have the keyword, so if you're using that, you will be using these guys. Unforgiven Task Force is a weak but shooting-focused detachment, so they work fine there. Ravenwing Knights already have good shooting, so not much use for extra anti-infantry. As I mentioned, they're very good with +1 to wound to clear those chaff that would slow down your terms and companions in the Deathwing Task Force. From there, we have a few more to cover. In terms of Righteous Crusaders, they do like the Feel No Pain vow, but not much else from this detachment is super useful to them. Champions of Russ, the Sagas again don't do too much for them, similar to the Crusader vows, though if you do get a couple of them going, they again will be really, really solid at beating up infantry just because they have a very large amount of attacks for what they are. In the Liberator Assault group, the extra attacks and strength actually turns them into really solid melee damage dealers. Against pretty much anything like that isn't a Terminator, they'll be very solid at punching just because they've got high strength and a lot of attacks, and honestly with a Sanguinary Priest they really don't seem too bad, though again he's definitely more slanted to melee units already. Lost Brethren is a pure melee detachment that will mulch hordes with no issue, so not much use for them there. And Angelic Host is pretty similar. The Sanguinary Guard and Assault squads will generally handle infantry well enough that these guys don't particularly have a place in that detachment. But again, that's just kind of how that goes. In terms of competitors, normal intercessors definitely give them some solid competition. They're cheaper and they have a better objective rule, though the Sternguard do a good bit more damage both at range and in melee, and with devastating wounds they chip targets a lot better, especially things like Land Raiders that have that 2+ save, and the rerolls do help a little bit against the Oath of Moment target. Hellblasters do far more damage, but are also far more expensive. In general, I prefer Sternguard as actual like grunts, and Hellblasters for things like big shooting combos. I think that while they're in the same class of sort of infantry shooting units, really I think they are very suited to different roles. As I mentioned, Hellblasters are much better off hunting big game, you know, big vehicles and stuff like that with a bunch of attached characters, where Sternguard are just really good at doing their job as sort of a auxiliary unit on the flanks of an army, hunting down enemy infantry, which they do with ruthless efficiency, one could say. In terms of their best uses, it's pretty simple. The Sternguard make very good anti-infantry hunters. They have enough firepower to deal with a lot of battle line units with relative ease, and the dev wounds do help them chip in against big targets, and their melee is actually pretty solid at bullying lighter units and even small groups of Space Marines just because they have so many attacks. Despite being a veteran unit, as I mentioned, I think they work better as super dangerous grunts that pack a lot of firepower. And they are pretty valuable on the objective game because so many armies rely on chaff to capture objectives. Things like Gretchen, who rely on having just so many models you can't chew through them all. These guys have more than enough attacks to deal with them with ease. And in melee especially, to finish any units off. And things like Sisters or Eldar, they will punch them so efficiently. It's very good. Again, just use them as roaming squads to capture objectives on the flank. And in general, it's just solid to have. You have a lot more damage on your objective units, though I generally wouldn't run them in bigger units. I would, again, keep them as auxiliary objective units to just hunt enemy light infantry. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.